This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.
Hi guys, my name is Kądzielska-Koper and you are watching Common Sense Generation. With me is Benjamin Passfield, PhD candidate at Oxford University. Benjamin, thank you very much for showing up.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You have all of those interests in political philosophy, and recently, also, you're interested in this phenomenon of populist right-wing parties, how they are taking over the young voters.
Yeah.
So, how does it look right now in Europe? Or who is voting for those, let's say, right-wing populist parties?
Yes, so what we saw with the recent EU elections at the start of June was a big shift to the populist right overall. So I think in 10 out of the 27 EU member states, populist right parties came in first or second place, which is their best ever result, and including in the top 3 countries of France, Germany and Italy. And that seems to have been disproportionately driven by a shift of the youngest voting cohorts away from green-type parties towards populist right ones. So the first time that the Zoomers got to vote in an EU election was in 2019. And there they earned the sobriquet Generation Greta after Greta Thunberg because they voted very heavily for these green left-wing parties. This time around, they have defected in large numbers to the populist right, primarily in France, where the National Rally got a 32% vote share among the youngest age group. In Germany also the AfD did well. They got 16% overall, which is up 11% on their previous score. And a related party, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht, which is on the left but on the paleo left, so immigration restrictionist, averse to gender ideology, etc. They also got another 6 points. And populist right parties got 30% plus of the vote among the youth cohort in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Poland, and they also did very well in Spain, where they got almost a quarter. So it's a very significant shift, and it seems to have come mostly at the expense of the Greens.
So the young people want to vote for right-wing populists, and why is it so, or why we suppose is it so, and who are those voters, more female or male?
Right, so on the gender issue, it's strongly polarized in every country except France, so it's much more heavily male. For example, I think in Belgium, 32% of male Zoomers voted for Vlaams Belang, the populist right separatist party, but only 9% of females. And that sort of size gap is evident in most of the other countries I mentioned. In France, it's the same for men and women. The question of why that gender polarization has opened up is an open one. I think part of it is probably that young women today are doing better in educational terms in the labour market and in kind of the dating market than younger men, so they probably feel less ideologically disenfranchised or dissatisfied with the status quo. I think there are probably also some sort of evolutionary sex differences playing a role. So on average, I think social psychologists have proven that women are more agreeable, which tends to make them more likely to conform with the kind of current elite orthodoxy. And at the moment, that's a left-coded, woke one. Young men more disagreeable, so less susceptible to that. There may also be some sex differences that are kind of modulating male-female reactions to mass immigration, because obviously concern about mass immigration is one of the major drivers of the populist right. And for various reasons to do with like different levels of empathy and to do with different levels of sort of trust towards outgroups, females seem to be less concerned about that on average. Part of the explanation for why France seems to have been an outlier is perhaps that French women are as concerned about mass immigration as young French men because they have a serious problem with like immigrant crime, especially sexual crime towards females. So that probably partially helps to explain why France is the outlier on that. As for the question of why younger voters have shifted populist right overall, it seems to be a few things. So one of them is definitely that they're ideologically anti-status quo. So they think the current elite consensus offers them kind of poorer intergenerational prospects than their parents and grandparents had.
I think actually this is a huge issue, the fact that young people, when they look at the market, they realize that they will actually never achieve what their parents achieved.
Yeah.
They are going to be poorer, or they have less job opportunity. And this, of course, brings a lot of dissatisfaction, but also distrust in the state. And the answer to is either very often right wing or the left wing. So okay, we destroy the system altogether, and not be in it anymore because this game is unfair, and we don't want to play it.
Yes, I think that's absolutely spot on. So there are kind of economic and cultural dimensions to this. Economically, I think they feel shortchanged because affordable accommodation is becoming more and more rare in Europe. So rents are driven by high levels of mass migration, property prices are higher. At the same time, mass migration creates labour market competition and real wage suppression. And when you add those together, the prospect kind of affordable family formation, being able to afford a house and a couple of kids, which our ancestors took for granted, is now increasingly out of reach for a growing proportion of younger people. And in addition to that, environmental policies like net zero tend to have a regressive economic impact. So if you're on lower incomes, pushing up the prices of energy and heating and transportation in the name of greenery kind of just makes that worse. The COVID lockdowns obviously were a huge shock to that cohort as well, because younger people disproportionately paid the price for it for the benefit of older generations primarily.
Here again, you're right. I think it's worth elaborating a little bit further, but younger people, because of all of these lockdowns, so all of the education systems, they needed to be taken out of it, or in some form of Zooms or other. But definitely they had those 2 years sometimes outside of their schools, away from their peers, which needed to have a huge effect on their many levels, but on their education, but also on their psychology, lots of things. And then again, it is this element which right now might have an effect at the university careers or at their ability to get to the universities. So there needed to be like a really like punch from the state that, wow, now we can take a lot from you in order to preserve life, let's say, of older people, and you have to pay for it.
Yeah, sure. It has had a big measurable kind of psychological and educational impact. It was not very good for the mental health of young people at all to be kind of cloistered away for 2 years by themselves. The educational performance got significantly worse as a result of it. And I think not only is there the sense that kind of the young people paid the price for the benefit of older generations, but the state has handled it in a kind of reckless and arrogant fashion. That the scientific basis for lockdowns in education was quite weak, but they didn't admit how weak it was at the time, especially of like keeping younger kids out of school. They shut down a lot of speech about it, so they called everyone who was skeptical of it at the time and said that this was an unnecessary overreach, was, basically a conspiracy theorist or an extremist. And they've never really kind of apologized for that. There is no sense that there's been any kind of autopsy or apology for getting it wrong on that. So when you add that to everything else, the labor market and housing market situation, and the Ukraine war, which has produced like 40-year high inflation, which again is obviously worse for people on the lowest incomes, which tends to be the youngest people, you've got a kind of perfect storm of sources of dissatisfaction.
Absolutely, those are very serious sources of dissatisfaction. And again, it brings people in this age either to become really extreme on right wing or extreme on left wing, but somehow to react and make the state realize that they are there and their needs are there. But talking about also the accommodation and the fact that those prices of housing went up so dramatically in most of the European major cities, that this main stability that you actually have a place to live is taken away. And when you don't have a place to live, where you're supposed even to take care of what's going around you, of your state, if you're not benefiting out of it in this, because without your space, it is hard to set up a family. And it's hard to also to focus on, for example, a job when you're so afraid of losing something. So So we see this as a shift that they are voting for those parties in hoping that some sort of change will come.
Yes.
But we have another phenomenon about those populist parties, and this is their presence in popular social media.
Yeah, I think this is the other crucial ingredient. Alongside the ideological dissatisfaction, populist right parties have proven most successful at kind of harnessing that, because their social media game on things like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube is massively better than all the other parties combined. If you measure it by kind of the number of TikTok followers, for example, the AfD easily exceeds all the other parties combined. Same thing for the National Rally in France, same thing now for Reform UK and Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom. And Donald Trump has just joined TikTok, so we'll see how he does, but probably similarly successful. When you combine that with data showing that young people primarily get their information now from these kind of video apps, rather than from kind of print form journalism like older generations, it's a very potent combination. And they've really perfected the art of producing this kind of punchy, short, humorous content that has kind of a subversive countercultural chic and good vibes, and they're kind of producing music videos as well. And that has really enabled them to tap into the youth vote to a greater extent than establishment parties or left parties.
Yeah, 1.04 billion users monthly of TikTok, and this is all of this content. It mostly goes to young people, and it's based on images, and images connected to emotions, and then they lead the political changes and political decisions. And sometimes it's just they are just fed up with the status quo.
Yes, I mean, I guess the downside of it is that it's short on policy detail. But given that for various reasons politics is increasingly becoming about identity and belonging, it is a very effective format for reaching out to people on that basis, because you can communicate more about your identity in the space of like a 30-second clip than you can in a 2,000-word piece in a newspaper. And the identity construction that the radical right, or the populist right, has perfected online has had the benefit of having really good aesthetics as well, frankly. Like the woke orthodoxy that young people, especially young men, are rebelling against is not like Woodstock era 1960s leftism, which had a kind of sex appeal to younger people, if you like. Wokeism, it has a hideous aesthetic in many respects. It's not appealing or attractive, and by contrast, the radical right has especially constructed this kind of more appealing masculine identity or masculine coded identity. Jordan Bardella, the leader of the National Rally, 28 years old, kind of photogenic, it typifies how they've done this. So he's kind of presented as like gym going and clean cut and put together. And when you contrast that with like purple haired, soyified they-thems on the left, it has a lot of appeal.
Swimsuit.
Exactly, yeah. It has a lot more aesthetic appeal to younger voters.
But this is also very important elements to add, that that there is this aesthetic appeals here, much more order, clear cut, and you said some definitely going to some masculinity and promoting this, to the contrary to what's going on, especially in the wokeism, which is very much just simply ugly, and also they want to create all of those creatures who are nor women, neither men or women, and they also somehow even more like inhuman. Yeah. They're supposed to be inhuman, with either colorful hair or very pale, or with added some things, or looking like animals. So everything which takes away their humanity, which paradoxically is not something which is very appealing for young men. It's for some group of young men.
Yeah. And that probably is another part of the explanation for the gender polarization. So in addition to the factors I mentioned earlier, I think that the aesthetic costs or deficits of like wokeism are even worse for men than for women, because it is a very feminine coded aesthetic, or even a trans coded aesthetic. For young men, it doesn't really offer anything except kind of like getting like weak and flabby, or possibly just changing your sex altogether. So having this kind of aesthetic contrast definitely is helping them on social media.
And then right now those parties are growing, but do we actually know what sort of real political postulate they have? Or is it vague and more just being against the majority?
Yeah, so ideologically, these populist nationalist parties are very eclectic on traditional measures. So if you were to use the sort of ideological tests that the parents and grandparents of Zoomers and millennials have used, they look very amorphous. Economically, they range from kind of free market, small state parties like Confederation in Poland to big government protectionists like the National Rally in France. Geopolitically, they include realists and anti-interventionists like Fidesz in Hungary, as well as more hawkish pro-NATO types like Giorgia Meloni. And culturally, they mix traditionally right-coded positions like being very strong again on law and order and preserving national cultures with liberal-coded positions on gender equality, free speech. So that looks amorphous, but the unifying theme that runs through it seems to be a preoccupation with trying to provide demographic, cultural and economic security to younger generations who feel that on all of those fronts, the offer of both big business right-wingers and of woke leftists just makes all of those things more insecure for their future. So I think that's kind of what unifies it. But what it will point to is the need for a new ideological compass going forwards. Like the old one of like economically left-wing and culturally leftist on one wing and social traditionalism and economic liberalism on the right will not be able to predict this future very well. The youth-powered right is likely to combine elements of cultural liberalism like free speech, gender equality, with immigration restrictionism and pro-natalist policies that are designed to make family formation more affordable. So that will involve elements drawn from left and right. So yeah, they're a new alignment basically.
I think that's what you mentioned, the fact this call and this huge desire for some form of security is a need for a young generation when they see that our capitalism system is very much in favor of big companies and doesn't give that much for them as the opportunity to grow, for example, bigger than their parents. Their parents usually could be directors or managers or even heads of banks or so on. But when those people, they see they won't be able to do it, the same thing. And by comparison, is already seen as unfair. But on the other hand, I think there's two factors which do shape the mentality of young people. First of all, is the COVID pandemic, which showed all of us that the human rights can be violated very easily by the state, especially when the state doesn't know what to do. And the state definitely, all of the states didn't know what was the answer to the pandemic, and they sacrificed a lot of it in order to at least not to create something worse. But we didn't know what was the end outcome. Would it be so much worse or not? And the other thing is that I do think that the war on Ukraine, especially that for example, in UK there are a lot of Ukrainian immigrants, but they are all around Europe, so we see people. And we of course see images from Bucha or from other places where there are atrocities the same as on the level of in the World War II, but just next in the border, outside the border of European Union, and neither European Union nor United States is doing much about to stop it. So this feeling of insecurity has to be pretty big. That first of all, democracy is not everlasting and probably not the end of the history. Secondly, they cannot even afford a flat, or very often a room is already super expensive. And secondly, there is a clear, thirdly, there's a clear danger of war. Yeah. So then the young men are eager to vote right wing, but again, as you mentioned, young women are eager to vote left wing. So
apart from France.
Apart from France. So what young women get from the left wing?
Well, I think part of what they get is kind of being part of the approved tribe. So as I mentioned, like there are these measurable differences in agreeableness and conformism. So for various reasons, young women tend to be more psychologically distressed by being kind of an outlier or going against the crowd. So I think that's part of it. It's social respectability. I think they also feel like they're doing pretty well. They're doing better than guys educationally. They're earning more on average in their 20s. And they have kind of the whip hand in the dating market because there are differences in like the romantic preferences of men and women, basically. On average, women are more hypergamic or more picky, I suppose, in their romantic preferences than guys are, which means that whilst a minority of guys are doing very well in the age of kind of, dating apps.
20 to 80.
Exactly. 2080, yeah. The majority aren't, and at the fringe this has produced like the incel phenomenon. But it's produced a broader sense of dissatisfaction there, whereas I don't think women feel that to the same extent. For them, at the moment, it's kind of brought more sort of romantic freedom, if you like, than their ancestors may have had, and given them like a stronger hand in the dating market. So they're not as aggrieved at the status quo for that reason. And I think an additional final factor is the decline in fertility and family formation has had a really big impact on women's voting behaviour. Back when women had more children, got married and did it at a younger age, that meant that a lot of sort of naturally female impulses on average were kind of channeled in a more conservative direction, like risk aversion, for example, or trust, was more focused on like protecting your family unit. And that led women to historically, certainly in the UK where I'm from, and in America, to vote to the right of men until the 1960s. And then it's flipped since then. And I think a lot of that is because in the absence of children, those...
So it's basically the pill, yes?
Yeah. Yes. And in the absence of children to kind of be the focus of female empathy and bonding instincts, and the family is like the entity your risk aversion is trying to protect, you find that these impulses still are there, but they just get transferred in a sort of left-wing direction. So for example, the bonding impulses that women have because of like higher levels of hormones like oxytocin and so on, that would previously have bonded to children, in the absence of them, get attached to kind of out groups who are presented as vulnerable like children. So for example, illegal migrants. And the risk aversion, instead of being kind of directed towards economic stability and conservative fiscal policies, get redirected towards things like speech codes and emotional safety. So I think that's the additional kind of factor that has flipped them, and it probably is the key to kind of solving the gender gap in politics. If family formation could be made more affordable again, it would probably narrow, would be my prediction.
It seems like there's a saying that you become conservative when you have your children,
yeah.
Because then you just down so much into reality.
Yes.
And you have not that much time also for all the forms of protest being outside there. Thing. And then you realize also that the changes, not global changes, are the most important, but the small changes in your community, at the playground, at school, or at the shop are the crucial ones, or because that this is something which suddenly becomes your priority. Yes. In order to, especially at the first 2-3 years, to keep the child alive. Yeah. And your life functioning. Well, all extremely interesting, somehow scary as well, because when we look at those shifts, do you think that, because obviously when this generation, those are young voters who are right now 18, but in the next election, they're going to be much older, 4 or 5 years older, depends which election we're talking here about. But so their priorities might change, their approach might change. But do we actually know? Is it like that? Do we know it from the previous, the youngest generation? How such was the shift of voting among the young people when they get, like, instead of 18 they get 25 or 24, and then they go to the voting. Was there choices? Do they stay with the same one, or they tend to go for?
I mean, historically, so-called life cycle effects generally mean that people move rightwards as they age politically rather than leftwards. That's certainly true in the English-speaking world. And that probably has various causes, like as you get more responsibilities, as you have a family, as you're more liable to pay tax. Suddenly, like left-wing revolutionary politics seems a lot less appealing than when you were young and carefree. So if that phenomenon holds, then you would expect that they would not get more left-wing as they age. There has to be a couple of caveats probably added to that. The factors that drove life cycle effects have weakened. As I mentioned, one of them is family formation. Obviously, as that declines, you're that much less likely for that reason to become more conservative. And the other is, I guess, owning a house. If you're always locked out of home ownership and with it kind of being a proprietary capitalist with a stake in the system, then that factor is weaker. But with those caveats, you wouldn't generally expect people to get much more left-wing as they get older. And another factor worth mentioning is that cohort effects are often kind of measurable and strong. Like the baby boomers had a strong cohort effect in cultural liberalism from like the 60s era, and they never kind of moved on from that. The cohort effect for the Zoomers seems likely to be this combination of like the lockdowns, inflation, the wars in Ukraine, and all of the pressures economically and socially that mass immigration are bringing. And that could have a durable effect upon their kind of demographic and cultural preferences going forward. So I think it might well stick.
Benjamin, thank you very much for explaining this all of us. This was Benjamin Passfield on Common Sense Generation, talking about the preferences of the youngest generation in voting, especially in Europe. I hope you found it interesting. And what is, of course, very important, that you write down your comments, and maybe you have questions as well, but write it down under this video. Thank you very much for watching our show, and I also thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.